The Tavari strike fleet entered the Delphine Arc 7 corridor like a surgical knife sliding into flesh. Silent, clean, procedural. 10 cruisers in a curved interception formation, hulls ripple-shielded, transponders dark, thermal signatures masked beneath deep space radiation scatter. They operated under Standard Interdiction Protocol 4-9-C, reserved for unauthorized vessels trespassing near the demilitarized fracture zone. It was a routine maneuver, the kind of engagement officers barely remembered by week's end. Their quarry? A solitary Terran ship adrift near the corridor's magnetic shadow line, tagged on long-range scan as Aegis call. No escort call, no acceleration signature or evasive drift. Just slow, stable tumble, calm, silent, the kind of target you intercepted out of habit. Admiral Kesht Varun stood on the forward command bridge of the Tavari command vessel, Vikar Null, eyes fixed on the tactical projection. He was already bored. The data coming from the fleet's forward scanners was pitiful. Low energy readings, zero thermal variance, no sign of propulsion cycling or shield modulation. The human vessel broadcast an ancient ID ping every 60 seconds, the kind of civilian distress transponder most navies discarded after one generation. Varun's second officer offered the tactical summary with detached indifference. No active weapons grid, no electronic countermeasures, low-grade hull shielding, undergunned or unarmed. Likely a science vessel, perhaps conducting unsanctioned mineral analysis or long-range telemetry. A violation, but barely worth comment. Still, protocol was protocol. The fracture zone was sensitive airspace. The Tavari High Table had decreed a policy of zero tolerance for incursions, regardless of scale or intent. Varun issued the order. Standard lock-in, board and sweep, retrieve flight data. If they resist, disable. If they surrender, extract. Around him, officers adjusted fleet positioning for optimal interdiction geometry. Cruisers tightening the noose around the drifting human ship. The Aegis call remained motionless. As the Tavari ships began decloaking, their stealth lattices folding away like peeling skin, the human vessel gave no sign it noticed. No change in rotation, no burst of EM chatter, no pulse to defensive grid. Its navigation lights blinked in lazy compliance. Its hull, a dull composite slate, showed scarring from what looked like atmospheric re-entry burns, but nothing recent. It floated like dead cargo, vacant. Varun frowned. It wasn't the behavior of a smuggler or spy. It was too passive, too flat. Still, he dismissed the instinct. It was a Terran problem after all, always clumsy in space, always operating under outdated tech with no understanding of threat posture. The idea that this ship might pose any kind of challenge was not only absurd, it was an insult to the Tavari doctrine of threat assessment, one that had been refined across 8 regional campaigns and 2 species suppressions. A Terran ship this far out, alone, was a gift, a demonstration opportunity. He broadcast a fleet-wide signal, all units authorized to engage boarding protocol, no kinetic response anticipated. Operational goal, soft capture, full data pull. On the lower decks of the strike fleet, the boarding units began assembling. Soldiers ran system checks on coil cutters, hull adhesives, atmosphere stabilizers, and sensor scramblers. Tavari boarding doctrine emphasized speed, containment, and symbolic display. Enemy ships were not just neutralized, they were entered, shamed, dissected. Boarding team commanders began a secondary competition over which unit would clear and secure the human vessel fastest. This was tradition, morale building. When war became procedural, sometimes you needed theater. Aboard Aegis call, nothing moved. The closest cruiser, Tyvrak Den, began final alignment for direct hull interface. Twin mag limbs extended from its starboard armature, gripping onto the Terran vessel's docking ring. Hull lock confirmed. Boarding tether engaged. Team 1 prepped for breach. 7 Tavari infantry, 0 exo resistance expected. The cutter sparked once, then began a slow circle through the ship's outer frame. Onboard pressure normalized. Airlock integrity met minimum engagement threshold. That in itself was surprising. Most vessels this old leaked trace elements long before failure. Not this one. As the airlock hissed open, Team 1 stepped into a narrow corridor. Fluorescent overhead strips flickered intermittently. The walls were bone white, sterile, featureless. No visible terminals. No sign of resistance. A camera eye rotated above them, but no defense grid engaged. The floor was flat but subtly irregular, as if warped by heat or engineered just slightly wrong. The team's lead operator made a motion to advance. Behind them, the breach cutter sealed shut. On Vikarn Knoll, Admiral Varun watched the internal feed from Team 1's helmets populate on his side screen. He expected clear progression: hallway, secondary corridor, internal system access, and then control center override. It was textbook. This was a simple retrieval, a message to Terran Command: stay out of the fracture zone or be dissected. But as the minutes ticked on, his screen began to flicker. One by one, location beacons dropped into static. Audio channels glitched with atmospheric interference. Visual feeds repeated themselves. Same angle, same frame, over and over. When he queried Command Relay 2 for status confirmation, the return was blank. A minor glitch. Redundant systems would compensate. Boarding Team 2 was already en route. As Tavari Helm aligned its secondary lock to Aegis Call's rear dorsal ring, Varun gave the signal to proceed. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Aegis Call had already begun adjusting. Not engines, not weapons, just the corridors. Subtle actuators hidden behind false panels and overlapping. Motion sensors were shifting the floor by 1 millimeter every 20 seconds. Enough to feel like a phantom limb, enough to confuse inner ear balance without triggering environmental alarms. It had been designed that way, with intention. In the deep quiet of Aegis Call's inertial core, Captain Ronan Vek sat alone, bathed in the dull red hue of minimal interface light. His breathing was even. His hands rested on the console. He had not spoken. He had not moved. His eyes followed the heartbeat patterns of the boarding team. One was spiking. Another was already failing to stabilize posture. One more minute, he thought. Let them in. Let them find nothing. Let them start to feel it. Let them believe. It took less than 3 minutes for the first Tavari boarding team to realize something was wrong. Not in the way soldiers expect. No ambush, no gunfire, no hostile environmental traps. Just dissonance. A subtle, creeping misalignment between what they saw, what they felt, and what their suits reported. The lead trooper reached the corridor junction where, by schematic logic, the control nexus should have been. But the corridor looped, not sharply, not with obvious curvature, but with a gradual spiral that returned him to where he'd just been. 3 full circuits later, he still hadn't noticed the floor slanting by a fraction of a degree, or the ceiling light pulsing just off-tempo with his internal chrono. Location tags began flickering, at first dropping a meter, then snapping back, then vanishing entirely. The standard navigational pings embedded in their suits and fed through ship-integrated shortwave nodes failed to echo. The second operator opened a hatch that should have led to a maintenance sublevel. It led instead to a corridor they'd already passed, or hadn't. Walls seemed to reconfigure themselves when not directly observed, and then acted like they hadn't moved at all. The structure obeyed no constant geometry. The third Tavari, already lightheaded from the rotational drift, bent over and vomited inside his sealed suit. By the time the fourth member tried to signal external command, internal comms had dropped to static. Not abrupt cutoff, just decaying signal, like distance had suddenly increased without anyone moving. The team lead banged on the nearest panel with a pressure stabilizer baton. No sound, no resonance. The impact vanished into the walls as if the material swallowed vibration. The ship was silent. Not the kind of silence that suggested emptiness, but the kind that pressed against the eardrums. Dense, deliberate. They were not alone, and yet no one was there. No defenders, no crew, no resistance. But every Tavari in that corridor could feel the same growing certainty. They had stepped into something that was aware of them. Tavari physiology, honed for deep space maneuvering and high-gravity orientation, had one weakness. Inner ear equilibrium was highly sensitive to shifting architecture. What Aegis Call delivered was not chaos but precise, quiet manipulation. One floor panel twisted every 70 seconds. Wall curvature realigned without making a sound. Lighting strips flickered in recursive sequences that made motion tracking unreliable. Vestibular sensors began misreading up from down. Vertigo spread like a toxin. Suits registered perfect pressure. The mind insisted otherwise. And then the audio started. It didn't come from external speakers or shipwide alerts. It bled through the air itself. Deep, layered, barely audible at first. Screams, but not random. These were Tavari screams. Battle cries from known campaigns. Specific death screams from the Tavari's internal uprisings over a century ago. Voices that only soldiers with classified combat access would recognize. They looped unpredictably. 1 second silence. Next second, the dying rasp of a fallen general from the siege of Harakan Hollow. A whisper, then a shriek. Sometimes backward. Sometimes stretched until it sounded like mechanical grinding. The second team member froze. Suit mic live, whispering something under his breath. His audio feed cut mid-sentence. Then his locator ping vanished. Outside, aboard the Tavari command vessel, the bridge crew struggled to interpret the growing blackout. Admiral Varun barked queries to relay control. The data made no sense. Location markers conflicted. Thermal readings from inside Aegis Call spiked erratically, then dropped to sub-zero levels. Hull temperature rose and fell without cause. Some readings suggested atmospheric venting. Others claimed the ship had no internal pressure. Reactor scan patterns collapsed mid-capture. Every deck schematic retrieved from the ship's registration history now conflicted with live scans. Varun dismissed it at first as stealth interference. But then the false readings began echoing across ships in different positions. Interference wouldn't coordinate like that. Varun ordered 2 more cruisers to reposition and increase data relay bandwidth to the boarding team. Comms engineers rerouted half their output through localized beam focus to strengthen the signal link. It didn't help. Every attempt to ping the boarding party resulted in corrupted loops, fragmented video frames, or in some cases, nothing at all. Internal visual feeds stuttered and repeated frames out of order. One soldier was seen standing still in a hallway. Then again 10 seconds earlier, walking toward that same spot from the same direction. The footage played backwards, then forward, then stopped. He gave the order to pull up any life sign data. Biometric tags returned anomalies. Spikes of stress, yes, but also inconsistent pulse patterns. One soldier showed readings that suggested dual cardiac rhythms. Another showed brainwave patterns that matched REM sleep. No one was unconscious. They were moving, reacting. One had unholstered his sidearm and was aiming it at an empty wall, holding position like he expected something to burst through. But the footage didn't show fear. It showed confusion. Deep, cellular-level confusion. The kind born not of panic, but of loss of context. Admiral Varun turned from the screen and began issuing new directives. Boost sensor resolution. Activate thermal lattice scans. Increase gravimetric triangulation to confirm ship mass distribution. If it was a rogue vessel, it might have internal shielded compartments. But in the back of his mind, a thought began to surface. Half-formed, unwelcome. This wasn't malfunction. This wasn't technical misalignment. This was design. Somewhere in the middle deck of Aegis Call, a second boarding unit stepped onto what looked like a flight stairwell, except that the steps descended without end. They had counted 42 before the third Tavari in line turned around and whispered, "We've already been down this." They ascended again, only to emerge on a corridor perpendicular to the one they'd entered. One tried to carve a mark into the wall for tracking. The ship's surface rejected the tool. Scratches vanished within seconds. Another tried to drop a proximity tag. It vanished. In the inertial core, Ronan Vec watched the data streams. Heart rates, limb velocity, vector lag, oxygen usage curves. Every fluctuation mapped against projection. Every emotional deterioration indexed. He said nothing. His hands hovered above the controls, not touching anything. The ship did not require him to intervene. It had already adapted. The triggers had been seeded. The environmental loops had been tuned to Tavari neurology. Their war archives had been sampled during the siege armistice talks decades ago. Digitized, encrypted, and buried. But the screams were accurate. The lost patterns matched. Their minds would fill in the rest. Vec didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply watched. Another life sign dropped off. Another team ping vanished. He checked the timer. Phase 2 would initiate soon. But for now, the ship was doing what it was made to do. Not kill, just show them what they'd never prepared to understand. Captain Ronan Vec sat in silence, hands still hovering just above the console interface, his eyes fixed on the feed as two more Tavari vitals spiked into terminal noise. Muscle collapse, suit system panic loops, then flatlines. Not death, not yet, but surrender of some kind. The kind that couldn't be logged by med scans or recorded by kill counters. It was the surrender of functional cognition. They had started out as soldiers. Now they were noise inside a labyrinth with no logic. And the labyrinth had only begun to breathe. Vec adjusted one control. No haste, no hesitation, just timing. The second protocol phase activated silently, without any physical feedback in the room around him. He didn't need it. The ship didn't need noise. Deep inside the engineering spine of Aegis Call, buried beneath its false schematics and modular hardware bays, a relay node flickered to life, spoofing a containment failure inside the primary reactor. The ship's emission profile began to spike in controlled, uneven surges. Not the crisp blast pattern of a weapon or a standard drive ignition, but the panicked, unbalanced escalation of a reactor that had slipped past critical regulation. To the Tavari fleet, it looked and sounded like a meltdown in progress. One of the ship's transceivers, tuned specifically to Tavari linguistic cadence, began screaming across open channels. Not human voices, not generic panic. This was mimicry, lifted from Tavari military disaster archives. Containment breach alarms, officer yells for lockdown, screams for decompression. The cadence was authentic because it had been studied, built and timed to match their doctrine's emergency failure patterns. Some of the voices were male, others female, all Tavari, all believable. Layered screams echoed out, some distant, others clipped by signal interference. The effect wasn't just disorienting, it was personal. It forced every Tavari commander listening to remember what real collapse had sounded like, and now it was happening inside a Terran ship. On the Tavari command vessel, Varun's bridge froze. Fleet-wide silence followed the first wave of audio. Not confusion, certainty. Reactor instability was a known hazard in war zones, and Tavari combat policy was hard-coded in its response. If an unshielded foreign reactor was undergoing meltdown, all adjacent craft were to disengage, expand spacing, and await fallout telemetry. Not because they were afraid of death, because contaminated wreckage altered gravitational corridors for weeks and turned local space into an information hazard. A mistake meant more than destruction. It meant corrupted data protocols, fuel coil infections, and command chain severance. For the Tavari, reactor contamination wasn't just a threat, it was taboo. The nearest two cruisers immediately powered lateral thrusters and began shifting position. Not in panic, in practiced hesitation. They had been trained for this. Open the gaps, minimize radiant overlap, hold for authority. But authority was now indecisive. Varun's command team scrambled to verify the meltdown signature. Sensor officers cross-referenced particle dispersal logs, magnetodensity curves, vent pressure estimates. Every reading came back unstable. They were watching a disaster unfold in slow motion, and no one knew if it was real. Inside Aegis Call, the reactor continued its staged collapse, modulated by layered distortion fields that fed different signal strengths depending on the scanning angle. One Tavari cruiser saw core temperatures at 1,900 Kelvin, another at 3,100. Another registered no reactor at all, just free-floating radiation with no origin point. That disparity triggered the next layer of protocol hesitation. Now they didn't just think it was a meltdown. They thought it might be something worse, a non-reactive cascade event, a misfire, a Terran device, designed to look like a meltdown but function like a singularity mine. No one dared ask the Admiral to confirm, because he hadn't moved. Varun stood at the center of the bridge, eyes unfocused, replaying the screams through his own headset. He recognized one voice, a field medic who died during the Kairos Rift collapse. She hadn't been in service for 40 cycles. Her last words were declassified 3 years ago. Now they echoed on the bridge of a Terran ghost ship. Outside, the fleet began to fracture. Cruisers peeled off vector, slight at first, just drift adjustments to widen their formation. But those small angles compounded. One ship's maneuver clipped a sensor field from its neighbor, creating a data feedback loop that sent false navigation alerts to two others. Automated threat assessments began to misalign. 5 ships registered overlapping emergency vectors. One reallocated energy to secondary shielding without authorization. Another activated radiation sails, interpreting the spike as a solar burst. They were unraveling, not from attack, but from interpretation. Inside the ship, the Tavari boarding teams tried to retreat, but the corridors were no longer what they remembered. Geometry rotated silently behind them. Hallways terminated into blank walls. Hatchways led back to the same room 3 times over. Floor inclines shifted by imperceptible gradients, inducing imbalance, pressure failure alarms, gravity coil misfires. They couldn't find the exit. Some didn't even try. One stood perfectly still in a corridor as the alarm screams continued overhead, clutching his helmet as if the sound was inside it. Another began carving a Tavari numeral into the wall with a utility knife, counting something only he understood. The internal broadcast loop shifted again. This time the alarms dropped out entirely. For 12 seconds, the only sound was a single Tavari child's voice repeating a training phrase: "Keep your hands together. Count your pulses. Breathe through the wall." It wasn't a Terran taunt. It was an exact quote from a Tavari psychological reconditioning manual for trauma survivors. Vec had embedded it to play only if enough bio-signature variation triggered a panic cluster. He sat unmoving, eyes on the rising tension curve of the fleet's positional map. Then, without flair or emphasis, he pressed a single command key. The cold void discharge array engaged. There was no sound, no visual cue from outside. The weapon had been built to operate like a directional thought. It simply fired. A silent pulse of magnetically shaped EMP arced across space in a tight cone, enveloping the core of the Tavari formation. 7 ships, each powered, each fully shielded, went dark. All systems cut. Communications, navigation, emergency drives, every onboard relay fried in silence. They drifted, dead weight, their lightless hulls rotating through the corridor like corpses in orbit. An Aegis call never moved. There had been no beam, no flash. Just the message buried inside the silence. "You should not have come." Inside the inertial core, Captain Vec didn't blink. He just watched the gravity map shift, watched formation and cohesion collapse. He took a breath. Not of relief, just calibration. Now the message would begin, and it would be written in what the Tavari feared more than death: doubt. The pulse came without warning, without flare, without fanfare. One moment, the Tavari fleet hummed with command chatter, power routing, and silent tension. The next, it collapsed into silence. It wasn't the silence of radio static or blocked comms. It was the kind of absence that left no trace. A perfect cut. 7 cruisers, broad-shouldered warships, fully powered, formation aligned, simply stopped. No alarm sounded, no impacts triggered. Their engine cores dimmed, control surfaces locked, and emergency drift stabilization activated without human input. Within seconds, they became massive, inert shells coasting on momentum alone, their systems gutted by a shape-focused EMP that bypassed traditional shielding by mimicking false emission harmonics. From the bridge of Vakarn Knoll, Admiral Varun watched with frozen disbelief as his fleet crumbled. His first reaction wasn't fear, it was confusion. His command chair, normally fed by real-time positional telemetry from the entire strike group, now reported phantom echoes and data ghosts. Half his screen went blank, not with error warnings but with null responses, as if those ships no longer existed. He called out, no response. He rerouted through auxiliary systems, nothing. He checked hull proximity bands. 3 ships were now drifting on paths that would intersect in under a minute. Not by sabotage, just inertia. That was the genius of it. In deep space, motion without correction is motion without mercy. The Tavari had trained for boarding operations, for plasma exchanges, for orbital descent, but not for this. Not for silence this complete, this engineered. No ship moved to help another. No cruiser adjusted to recover boarding teams. Without comms, without internal nav synchronization, they were blind. One cruiser veered slightly, its lateral thrusters firing too late, colliding with a disabled hull broadside. The impact didn't cause destruction, but it was enough to shear off one sensor mast and send the ship into an uncontrolled lateral spin. Another ship, closer to Aegis Call, began to vent atmosphere, slow at first, then faster, then violently as internal structural pressure reversed across a torn bulkhead. No explosion, just another corpse entering a slow spin. Inside the ghost corridors of Aegis Call, the boarding parties were done. Some were unconscious, others broken in more permanent ways. With power cut, internal servos had shifted into sleep mode posture, and gravity control dipped to bare minimum. A few Tavari soldiers floated, limbs twitching in suits that no longer fed them oxygen regulation cues. Their equilibrium was gone. Some had removed their helmets in a panic, convinced the pressure readings were lying. They weren't, but their minds couldn't hold shape in a space that never obeyed rules. One had attempted to scrawl coordinates across the floor with a carbon stylus, coordinates that didn't exist. Another had locked himself into a supply alcove and begun mumbling ritual codes from a Tavari funerary cycle, repeating his own name backwards until his voice gave out. The worst were the ones still awake. They weren't screaming, they weren't moving, they were just sitting, sometimes upright, sometimes curled into walls, sometimes staring into empty corners where they thought exits had been. Their suit cams were still broadcasting internally, flickering in and out across corrupted frequency bands. Ronan Vec watched those feeds with no shift in posture. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He wasn't waiting for them to die. That wasn't the point. The test was complete. The Tavari doctrine was already broken. All that remained was proof. On Vakarn Null, Varun made one last effort to re-establish chain of command. He attempted to route a low-frequency pulse signal through the surviving fleet members. 3 ships left, including his own. The signal failed, not because of interference, but because the ships had entered autonomous drift protocol, interpreting the EMP blackout as a command severance event. That meant each surviving ship now considered itself a disconnected node, fully isolated and therefore independently responsible for immediate threat analysis. One began charging emergency jump coils, unsure if it should flee. Another powered interior self-purge cycles in case boarding had occurred. Varun knew what would happen next. Once independent threat profiles reached internal panic thresholds, the crews would either abandon ship or destroy it. He tried to override the emergency sequences. The console blinked once, then died. The admiral stood slowly, one hand bracing the rail near his command chair, his mouth dry. His crew waited for instruction. None came. He stared at the projection of Aegis Call still drifting ahead, unmoving, unarmed, untouched. No visible weapon ports, no shield bursts. The Terran ship hadn't rotated, hadn't retaliated, hadn't even transmitted a warning. Yet 7 ships were now drifting wreckage, and his own command was fragmenting into isolated crisis nodes. He didn't understand how. That's what broke him, not the silence. The logic collapse. This had been an interdiction run. Routine. The humans weren't supposed to do this. In the inertial core of Aegis Call, Ronan Vec finally moved. Just a slight flex of his wrist. He reached toward the communications package, already compiled, already curated. The files included internal boarding feeds, biometric breakdowns, deck misalignments, sensor corruption layers, auditory confusion triggers, and controlled collapse timestamps. Not for psychological terror, not to frighten, but for demonstration, to show clinically what had happened and how. The Tavari would need that data. It was the only thing that would force them to change their doctrine permanently. As the broadcast channels opened, Vec routed the signal through a wide band loop. Every Tavari ship still capable of receiving data would get the transmission, either live or in recovery. No encryption, no demand. Just the truth, laid bare. One human ship, no kinetic weapons. One operator, no fire return. He didn't watch the files play. He didn't need to. This wasn't for him. Somewhere outside, one of the Tavari captains began sending emergency requests for internal detonation authorization. Another opened a sealed message capsule, unsure whether to run, fight, or initiate crew-wide euthanasia. They had no orders. They had no formation. They had only silence, loss, and the knowledge that nothing visible had defeated them. Ronan Vec adjusted the light in his command capsule, leaned back slightly, and exhaled. He had never stood. He had never drawn a weapon. And yet the Tavari fleet was gone. The Tavari had no word for what was happening. Not in any active doctrine, not in their war lexicon, not in the training codes passed between officers since the first Warpole ship was launched. There were terms for retreat, for suppression, for countermeasures in the face of viral infiltration or kinetic overwhelm. But there was no designation for losing control to nothing. No strike, no storm, no resistance, just absence. Absence that made things stop working, made people stop thinking, made orders vanish and certainty disintegrate. The transmission came during that silence. No introduction, no diplomatic framing, just signal integrity too clean to be coincidence. The ships still active, 3 at most, received the feed first. Their systems flagged the file structure as originating from external hostile unit, but there were no viral markers, no penetration protocol. It wasn't malware. It was just content, footage. They could choose to watch. Some did immediately, others hesitated. None of it mattered. The message was seeded fleet-wide by then. The feed opened with helmet cam overlays. Tavari boarding units inside Aegis call, recorded in raw resolution. It wasn't dramatized. It wasn't enhanced. Just exact replay. Soldiers stepping into corridors that changed angles when their heads turned, doors that looped back into the same space again and again. One segment showed a Marine standing at attention, while blood trickled from his nose, eyes unfocused, murmuring protocol fragments. Another showed a hallway pulsing with false red light as 6 Tavari weapons pointed in every direction, except the right one. Screams came in cycles, sharpened by loss of context, not amplified. These were familiar voices to the captains listening now. Men they'd deployed, crew they'd trained. The feed progressed, not linearly, but recursively. The same 6 seconds from 3 different helmets. The same hatch opening to 3 different outcomes. The bridge lighting dimmed on one Tavari ship as its captain stared into the open holofeed. The final frame emerging slowly from static like a closing breath. No resistance, no weapons. You failed. No embellishment. No demand. Just that. The discussion began immediately across what was left of the command channel. Sparse, disjointed, paranoid. Captains argued whether the footage itself was an attack, a cognitive intrusion, a mimetic weapon. Tavari intelligence protocols warned of exposure to certain layered audio-visual stimuli that could compromise strategic judgment. But those warnings had never referenced humans. Not like this. 2 captains flatly declared the content was contagious, that viewing the footage risked informational infection. They issued crew-wide isolation orders, then authorization for full internal self-destruct. Better to eliminate an entire ship than risk compromised memory transmission into the broader fleet architecture. One ship's lights blinked out mid-sentence. A second followed 40 seconds later. 2 detonations, silent in the vacuum, visible only as glimmers of burnt gas trailing in expanding arcs. On Vikarn Null, Admiral Varun stood still, not in shock, just in waiting. He had no more commands to give. He had watched his officers break under the weight of implications that hadn't yet been spoken aloud. The defeat wasn't in the weapon, it was in what they had to admit, that they had boarded a ship expecting an enemy and found something worse, something that did not fight, that only showed. He gave the final order with a voice that felt like someone else's. Withdraw. All units. Abandon corridor. Exit clean. No pursuit. His crew moved with the stiffness of post-collapse protocol, doing as they were told, because if they stopped to think, the spiral might take them too. One by one, the remaining Tavari ships rerouted course vectors and began low-energy drift withdrawal. They did not fire. They did not scan for retaliation. Their formation was ruined, their command integrity dissolved, their sense of operational superiority reduced to a historical footnote. Aegis call never moved. No weapons tracked them. No chase initiated. It simply remained, a stationary wound in space, watching. Inside the inertial core, Ronan Vec leaned forward, adjusting one control to close the transmission loop. He watched the remaining ships break formation, plotting their paths outward like slow echoes fading in concentric rings. He marked the moment each exited scanning range, tagging breakdown timestamps, placing each strategic collapse on a personal log. He was still an analyst after all. This had never been about kills. This was about proof. Not proof of human firepower, but proof of an idea. That belief in control was itself a vulnerability. The Tavari had come with procedure. They would leave with uncertainty, and uncertainty would last longer than debris. He glanced down at the stylus he dropped when the feed first activated hours ago. It still lay on the console floor, unmoved. He bent, picked it up with precise calm, and slotted it back into its holding clip. Around him, the room pulsed quietly with diagnostic lights. The ship was powering down. It had done its work. Vex said nothing. The ship said nothing. And outside, the Tavari fleet limped into the dark. Slower now, smaller now, carrying with them a truth they could never categorize in their manuals or bury in silence. Fade to black. 3 weeks later, inside a secure orbital bastion above Tavari Prime, the High Command convened behind sealed pressure vaults and encrypted air. The mood was not one of outrage, nor one of mourning. It was calculation poisoned by doubt. There had been losses before, ships taken in skirmishes, alliances disrupted by Terran interference. But this was different. The records from the Delphin Arc 7 corridor had been reviewed, looped, debated, and cataloged. What they found was not a battle. It was a rupture in assumption. No weapons had been detected. No resistance had been encountered. The boarding parties had simply collapsed. The fleet had dissolved. And no one could explain how without admitting something far worse, that their doctrine had become obsolete. Not through superior technology, but through an engagement that never actually happened. The internal memos reflected that panic. Officers wrote in passive voice, reports filled with qualifiers and approximations. Even the language began to degrade under the pressure of the event. They didn't fear the Terran ship for what it did. They feared it for what it revealed. That engagement itself, if misunderstood, was vulnerability. By the end of that week, an emergency reclassification directive was issued. All human ships operating beyond Treaty Echo were to be redesignated as cognitive engagement risk assets. No ship bearing Terran registration could be assumed neutral, regardless of configuration. Civilian vessels, science vessels, unarmed transports, none of it mattered. Every schematic in the Tavari threat database linked to Earth origin vessels was flagged as unreliable. A subnote was added to all automated tactical systems. Human schematics are deceptive by design. One line of thought, barely whispered in the War Council chamber, questioned whether humans had ever used real warships at all. If Aegis Call was what they deployed as a non-combatant, what did a human assault ship look like? That question was not answered. It was merely passed from admiral to tactician to committee until it became a quiet, private fear that no one was willing to speak aloud. The new doctrine stated simply, do not engage Terran vessels unless full fleet-level suppression is guaranteed. No boarding, no warning, no interpretation. If you cannot overwhelm, you do not approach. The Tavari lost the corridor. Delphine, Arc 7, a critical pass between resource lanes and neutral buffer sectors, was effectively abandoned. Not by treaty, not by force, just through hesitation. Commanders assigned to the region requested reassignment. Patrol logs went unsubmitted. The corridor fell quiet, and in that silence, Aegis Call became more than a ship. It became precedent, and from precedent, fear was born. Back on Earth, Ronan Vec disembarked without ceremony. No fanfare greeted him. His vessel was towed in silence to a classified orbital dock and removed from all active fleet logs. Debrief was short. Mission parameters, completed. Mission objectives, confirmed. When asked to provide notes, he submitted a single page of analytics marked by timestamps and anomaly drift curves. He was not awarded. He did not request recognition. Recognition had never been the point. Understanding had been the objective, and the Tavari now understood something they could never fully explain to themselves. In the Tavari Codex, an internal manual of cross-species threat designations and engagement procedures, one new entry was added, not with a number, not with a signature, just a phrase translated across dialects. Never assume the human ship is unarmed. That assumption had cost them 10 cruisers, a war zone, and the illusion that they understood war. The rewrite had begun. What would you do if the enemy didn't fire a shot, but still made you lose everything? Was Captain Vec a tactician, or something more terrifying? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think humanity should ever be trusted with ships like Aegis Call again? If this left your jaw clenched and your mind racing, hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to comment where you're watching from, and tell us, what would your species do after encountering this kind of ship?